Contact or constitution, reality in early phenomenology. If I want to consider today the two notions of contact and constitution as enabling and guiding a phenomenological discourse on reality, I want to stress from the start that I do not understand these notions as affording a straightforward representation of the relationships between real entities. In other words, I do not want to outright ask whether I am in contact with an autonomous reality or whether I constitute it. There is ample reason to be suspicious of this parlance, which stems in part from the history of phenomenology with its schisms between transcendental, ontological, realist, and eidetic methods. One of the biggest misunderstandings here, as Hedwig Konrad-Martius acknowledges in a talk that was held 20 years after Husserl's death, is to think that the notion of constitution would be exclusively concerned with the structures of consciousness, as if one could investigate how reality appears in consciousness without problematizing this fact itself. As Konrad-Martius puts it, the only aspect of reality that falls outside the focus of transcendental phenomenology is real reality or wirkliche Wirklichkeit, as that which would actually correspond to the reality intended by consciousness. To conceive of reality as fundamentally noematic, as something we intend, will always entail that the actual or real reality remains an unresolved rest, a troubling possibility out of methodical reach. This is the first reason for being suspicious of the efficacy of the vocabulary of constitution. It cannot keep its promise of a self-contained approach to reality because what is noematically constituted necessarily points to reality beyond itself. On the other hand, the notion of contact at once promises a more immediate approach to reality, one which from the start stresses our receptivity. If I am in contact with reality, I have the experience of something that is wholly different from me. I encounter an autonomous being which, as Konrad-Martius often stresses, shows itself from itself. But here we come upon a similar problem. Insofar as it is my experience of this autonomy, and so far as I have to recognize the otherness of the other, there is again an element of constitution involved. In other words, real reality may turn out once more to lie beyond our noema. Thus, it is easy to bring the investigation to a complete halt where two antithetical terms end up doing nothing more than apparatically referring to one another. In the interest of taking up my initial concern of not understanding them representatively or figuratively, I want to ask in how far this standstill is due to the way that we imagine or represent standing in contact with or constituting reality. In other words, what do we think of when we use the terminology in this way? And why does it yield a sense of reality as unattainable? One way to tackle these questions is by a via negativa, and following Max Scheler's idea that we cannot reflect on the execution or the performance, that is the Vollzug, of our acts, without them changing into objects of reflection. In other words, experience, as it happens, can be lived through, erlebt, but not at the same time and not as such be reflected on. What does that have to do with the problem posed here? In the context of Scheler, one finds the somewhat vitalistic notion that we experience reality as a resistance to the drive that unfolds in and as our acts and actions. Reality is not a plane of objects at our disposal, but something disclosed in the feeling of overcoming an obstacle. The concepts of self, other, and world are, by contrast, secondary phenomena we rationalize when this immediate driven existence encounters irresolvable problems. My take on this is that Scheler, in resorting to drives and pre-reflective modes of existing and experiencing, aims to recreate an immediacy of experience of the act without intellectually distorting it. He makes immediate experience intelligible, but seemingly at the price of turning us into driven creatures whose rationalizations obscure the ecstatic truth of being. With this approach, we can then add a third apparatic notion to our list, as it is impossible to phenomenologically reflect on our experience of reality if the originary mode of experiencing prohibits any form of reflection. And yet, I take Scheler's concern of focusing on the Vollzugscharacter of our acts as a valuable hint, and it does not seem necessary to me to distinguish as radically between immediate experience and mediate reflection. The implicit assumption in consulting Scheler in the first place was that the immediacy of experience, which seems to be promised by the pure execution of performance of acts, would also somehow bring us closer to phenomenologically addressing reality. Instead of using figurative terms which already presuppose a clear-cut distinction between I and non-I, attentively living through the acts themselves may provide one with a more successful approach. The inherent challenge in taking up this idea lies for me in the following: to live through and experience not from the standpoint from which the content of experience is already potentially reflected on. That is, to bracket the knowledge which preforms our phenomenological approach. Perhaps in contrast to Husserl's phenomenological meditations, which frequently involve the gradual exploration of ever more definitive objects, the phenomenological focus on Vollzug is asking us to consider an act as continuous immersion. Again, this does not mean that reflection on experience should be forfeited altogether, but that the ability of gradual examination should not hinder us in considering our immersive experiences. This is not to say that one cannot draw a comparable notion from Husserl's works. In fact, the immersive contact that the ecstatic Vollzug seems to suggest can also be found in his book Experience and Judgment, where Husserl describes a passivity that arises out of our own activity. Considering this idea more closely allows me to reflect on this further notion or further distinction that is implied in the opposition of constitution and contact, namely that of activity and passivity. According to Husserl, and now comes a quote, with the active apprehension that goes hand in hand in a double direction and according to a double form of modification, a modified activity belonging essentially to it. Accordingly, there's not only a passivity prior to the activity, as passivity of the originally constitutive temporal flux, which is only pre-constitutive, but also a passivity erected on this, a passivity which is truly objectivating, namely one which thematizes or co-thematizes objects. It is a passivity which belongs to the act, not as a base, but as act, a kind of passivity in activity. In a broad sense, what Husserl is doing here, or what I take him to do here, is to show that activity and passivity cannot be separated at all, that they do not just refer to, but actually depend on one another. In actively apprehending something by, for instance, turning our attention to an object, and in perceiving its gestalt or one of its salient properties, we can rightfully be said to be active, and it is our directed attention that is the reason for the apprehension. But this activity alone is not objectivating the object, as it were. It is not as if consciousness is a beam that from itself actively illuminates the object. There is a passivity involved in this process, and this passivity means in the first place that the object we actively attend to is in the same act passively constituted. The idea of passivity here is necessitated, on the one hand, by the temporal structure of consciousness. Our conscious experience is passively pre-constituted according to the protensional-retensional passing of lived time. Thus, any object that we intend is necessarily a temporal object, and the way that it temporally appears in a constant originary nowness with its retentional tail and its protensional horizon is a matter of passivity, structural passivity, one could say. But does Husserl here simply mean that the passive aspect of objectivation is the result of this more fundamental structural passivity? It would seem to me that this passivity should not only be understood structurally, but also experientially. To be more precise, the idea seems to be that we can have a sense of objectivity forming in us as we thematize an object while and in apprehending it. The tricky part about conceiving of this double awareness is that it is comprised in one and the same act. The fact that it is the same act, that activity and passivity are simultaneous, fundamentally challenges the separability of passive contact and active constitution. But this remains an insurmountable dichotomy only if we stick too closely to a representation of constitution or contact as mutually exclusive acts or actions. A representational account suggests that both notions describe access to or constitution of reality based on the results, that is, based on the real objects we experience in one way or another. Objectivity is needed to give form to either contact or constitution. As a consequence, we would be hard-pressed to say what contact or constitution means without having some object that they refer to. But if we want to reflect on the passivity within activity, or the activity that unfolds as passivity, the complete ready-made object that we could employ as a means to understand this process would actually be a hindrance. If I think of what the reality is that I actively, passively apprehend, I lose sight of this apprehension itself, because the sense that I ascribe to it depends on what is apprehended. This does not mean that a reflection on the passive-active nature of apprehension has to do with nothing or with shapeless matter correlative to an as yet inchoate apprehension. The question is rather what an object can be and what objectivity itself is when we try to grasp it as it passively arises in us. The guiding question for this reflection might be the following. Is it a passivity in us, a sort of mental mechanism which effectuates the apprehension, or do we directly live through and experience this passivity? In other words, how is passivity experienced? In the following, I want to consider this passive activity a little more concretely. At this point, I would have liked to conduct my considerations along the lines of an illustrative life world example, such as looking at a coffee mug or gazing out of the window and talking about trees to illustrate the constitution of objectivity. But the problem I felt with this is that passive constitution would already be concluded by the time that we can speak of objects like trees or coffee mugs. Or to put it somewhat more precisely, what these exemplary considerations are in danger of doing is to direct our attention to an image or representation of experience instead of to the process of experiencing itself. Coming back to the pre-constitutive time structure of consciousness, one could try to describe this experiencing as a primarily temporal process. This would allow me to conceptually distinguish between several saliently different moments in the perception of an object. For instance, when considering the simultaneously active-passive constitution of an object, such as a coffee mug, now I'm talking about coffee mugs after all, one could imagine being confronted with the impression of a color, the part of a shape or certain light reflexes that are perceived before the whole mug is apprehended as mug. Here, time palpably plays a constitutive role because it is not just necessary that time passes for us to move from impressions or highlighted data to the apprehension. It is what happens during and through the passing of time, as the lived succession of moments making up our lebendige Gegenwart, that we are passively led to apprehend the object as such. What is guiding us in the primal impression is the primal impression and the potential expectation associated with it. On the one hand, we can be said to passively constitute and experience the expectation of apprehending a certain object based on what we see now. On the other hand, eventually apprehending this object does comprise a sense of agency that one could qualify as active. In other words, focusing on the temporal structure of consciousness does go towards a cogent distinction between what is active and what is passive in experience. One could try to put it shortly by saying that we experience passivity by having a sense of the time that it takes to be able to constitute an object, where the sense is explicated as our internal time consciousness with its constantly changing contents. So as a first result of the discussion, we now have a concept of constitution which does not merely point to an activity on our part, but in which is implicated an aspect of contact in the form of the pre-objective impressions that we can address as the basis of any apprehension. Representing or imagining this idea of constitution would mean to be attentive to the inchoate sensual impressions of visual objects. Additionally, one could also imagine applying this to sounds, where we apprehend a certain sound as the bang of a door, only after a temporal sequence of indefinite noises which, in themselves, would not refer to any identifiable source. But the more this whole discussion is pushed towards a consolidation in the title of constitution, the closer we come to an impressionistic picture of consciousness. While some experience may intuitively seem to conform to this mode of experiencing, especially those where the same data ambiguously point to different objects, to claim that it applies to all experiences seems questionable, to say the least. By contrast, in many cases, we rather seem to apprehend or recognize objects at once, or we do not even need to explicitly bring them to mind in order to engage with them, especially in practical scenarios. In these cases, the proposed model of constitution falls short because our sense of reality does not rely on a prior passive constitution that we would be more or less conscious of. At this point, the concept of contact may come in not as an antipode, but as a corrective by providing us with another view of the apprehension of the object discussed so far. What I want to focus on in this last part of the talk is the idea that when we apprehend an object, we are not constituting it by consolidating hyletic data, but that we are in fact making contact with it. In other words, what I want to consider is not activity and passivity before and after the constitution of an object, but the passivity that is in question in the very moment of constitution. Thus, I want to consider contact not in a representative manner as happening between two or more real entities, but again as an aspect of our experiencing. Initially, I have observed that one problem with the notion of contact is that an autonomous being we encounter or come in contact with has to be intended by us, such that any contact to reality, or even real reality, is from the start tinged pneumatically. But this is a superficial concern, which the discussion has already started to refute. The refutation is this: while the contact with a real entity takes on the form of intentionality, the actual apprehension of the thing in contact is due, in part, to a passive constitution. And insofar as we have a sense of this passivity, we cannot be said to be, in making contact, purely active. In other words, the passivity implied by contact does not merely consist in being approached by or encountering an autonomous entity, a being whose reality is the result of its own constitution instead of mine. Rather, the passivity implied by contact is also due to the fact that my apprehension of the object is itself passively constituted, that the experience of really being in contact is passive from the inside out. One could say that this apprehension of the object as passively constituted ties us to our experiencing, where what appears to me is at the same time foreign because it simply appears, and familiar because, in apprehending it, I already know myself to be in contact with it. Attentively considering this double nature of apprehension is one way of grasping reality as a phenomenon. Its phenomenality is not constituted by us, nor showing itself from itself, but the result of an overlapping of passivity and activity. Grasping a real entity points us to something external, wholly different from us. It is, to use an expression by Merleau-Ponty, an an sich für mich. So in accordance with Taylor, one cannot conceive of this double aspect in simultaneous reflection. But this doesn't mean that we remain intellectually unaware of it. The kind of awareness involved in this active-passive mode of experience is not aptly captured by the vocabulary of constitution and contact, at least as long as one understands both terms figuratively. What my discussion has suggested here is that it is possible and maybe even necessary to disfigure, to a certain extent, the terms we use to think phenomenologically, especially as they serve to represent to us experiential scenarios. In this sense, contact and constitution are not suitable to describe an encounter with reality or real entities. Instead, they point to the way that this encounter is differentially structured in itself to afford us one possible way of addressing the phenomenon of reality. Thank you.